We're very glad this evening to be able to work with our topic, Global Turmoil, the Economic Implications for Canada. I will ask our panelists this evening to proceed in the order that they are invited, and I will ask each of you please to speak for 10 minutes, and then we will open the floor for questions. Please just make note of your questions if you wish, and then you are free to ask your questions to either a particular panelist or to the panel as a whole, and they can flip a coin to decide who will begin to answer your question. But please let me say that we intend to be quite informal this evening, and your questions will certainly be very welcome. Since we are a rather small gathering this evening, I'm going to go ahead with introductions for each of our three people tonight, and then we'll let them begin. Immediately to my right is Dr. Geoffrey Hale, who is a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Lethbridge. He teaches in the fields of public administration, public policy, political economy, and Canada-US relations. He's a native of Montreal, and Dr. Hale was educated at both Princeton and Western. He has taught at the UofL since 1999, and before that worked in business government relations with the Government of Ontario. Dr. Hale's principal research interests are public policy, particularly the political economy of North American integration, fiscal and budgetary policies, and related issues of public management, and the management of structural policy change. He's the author of numerous articles on Canadian fiscal and budgetary policies, the coordination of economic and social policies, and Canada-US relations in the context of the ongoing North American integration. His current work is entitled So Near and Yet So Far, Influencing American Policies Toward Canada. Welcome, Dr. Hale. We look forward to hearing from you this evening. Next to Dr. Hale is Dr. Herb Emery, who comes to us tonight from the University of Calgary, where he has taught since 1993, and where he's currently a professor of economics and program director of policy in the School of Public Policy. He is also managing editor of Canadian Public Policy, and from 2007 to 2012, he was professor in health economics, which was a joint appointment between the Department of Economics and the Department of Community Health Sciences in the Faculty of Medicine. His research interests and publications are focused on economic history, labor economics, and health economics, and his research has addressed the rise and fall of fraternal sickness insurance, the transition from private voluntary health insurance arrangements to compulsory government health insurance across the 21st century. His current projects include studies in reform of public health in Canada. Welcome, Dr. Herb Emery. And finally, a face that is familiar to many of us, Dr. Trevor Harrison, who is a sociologist. He is an associate director of the Prentice Institute, and he is also one of our research affiliates in the Prentice Institute. He's professor of sociology in faculty of pardon me, a slip on my part, in the university. There are other
I'd be happy to be there.
There are other faculties, and I have to acknowledge that. He is professor of sociology at the University of Lethbridge, and he is director of the Parkland Institute, which is an Alberta research network situated in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Alberta. Trevor's areas of research are Canadian society, militarism and political culture, nationalism, the Canadian Football League, and Canadian identity and electoral participation. He is best known for his studies in political sociology, political economy, and public policy. He's the author, co-author, and co-editor of 8 books, numerous journal articles and book chapters, and a frequent contributor to public media. In recent years, he spent considerable time in Greece. We're not sure, sailing the islands or doing a little bit of work at conferences.
It was all work, really.
Yeah. But nevertheless, he tells us it was work, and presenting at various conferences in Greece, and has written several op-eds regarding that country and its economic crisis. Welcome, Dr. Harris.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll let you begin, Dr. Hale, please.
Economic turmoil in 10 minutes. Okay. The reality of our current world is that nothing that we see in front of us can be taken for granted, and everything at present is up for grabs. We see this in the Eurozone, that the circumstances in the Eurozone have a veneer of stability with the capacity to come apart in any one of several directions, whether the indebted economies of Southern Europe or the possible disruption of energy supplies from Russia. That creates certain opportunities for Canada, but in an uncertain window. We don't know how long it will be before, or if we would be able to take advantage of them. That depends on our own domestic capacity to build pipelines to top water. China, something that has been driving much of the global economy over the last 10 to 15 years, is shifting more towards domestically driven growth. And that is something, a huge economy, huge continent-sized economy, basically shifting the entire basis of its productive sector that we haven't seen in quite some time. So we don't know what the impact of that is going to be, other than that if Canada is dependent on the growth of Asian economies to diversify its economy, to balance the United States, it's going to have to do work well beyond China. What are the implications of this for Canada? Well, Canada has been trying to diversify its trade relations over the last 5 or 6 years. However, with the falling oil prices, with the falling dollar, this is increasing the value of the Canadian currency against a lot of other currencies out there, making it harder for Canada to compete in other international markets. Donald Savoy, the great political economist and student not just of taxing and spending in Canada, but also economic development in Atlantic Canada, coined the phrase "pulling against gravity." That no matter what you do, something comes back to pull you back to where you started. And I think we are seeing the possibility of that with the Canadian trade diversification strategy, because the lower dollar, frankly, is good for the rest of the country outside resource-producing provinces like Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland. And so we're going to see some shift in the balance of growth over the next little while. Energy price shocks, another source of global economic turmoil, has multiple causes. Geopolitics, whether in the Persian Gulf or in the Russian neighborhood. Supply and demand, the fact that we have had such an increase in non-OPEC sources of oil, resulting, among other things, from fracking, and the spread of fracking in the United States. Technological change. Basically, the Canadian oil industry is today where natural gas has been for several years, in terms of being high-cost supply, marginal supply in many ways. Not entirely. Some of the oil sands people will stick through the downturn, but for a lot of marginal producers, we're going to see a lot of turnover. Is this another 1986, pointing to the beginning of a 15-year slump and restructuring of the resource-based economies of Western Canada? Or is it just another cyclical blip? Anybody who knows that can make a lot of money in the stock market. However, I don't think that any of our politicians would fall into that crystal ball category. Does this increase the potential for the completion of Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations? I think that's something that is outside of Canada's control. What does that mean for Canada? I think the prospects, the uncertain prospects for global prices and global production do point to a slowdown in the energy sector in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and elsewhere, Newfoundland especially, for the next 2 or 3 years. Beyond that, we have no idea. That said, our floating currency is doing the job it was intended to do. An 80-cent dollar basically is a huge shock absorber for the Canadian economy when a sector that has been providing 25% of our exports goes into the tank. So we are going to see some medium-term shift of regional growth potential towards Ontario. They desperately need it. And if there is a silver lining in this cloud, it might actually be that Ontario will get off equalization payments, which, and I would have said this when I was in Ontario 20 years ago, we have no business in giving them in the first place. We are going to see a lot of turnover among the smaller energy companies. That's an opportunity for entrepreneurship, but also for the takeover market. Will we see provinces take advantage of lower prices to increase retail gasoline taxes the way they did in the 1980s? Well, I hear a chorus of boos throughout the provinces, but when provinces are strapped for money, they look for easy targets. That's probably one of the easiest ones out there. Again, another silver lining in the dropping price of oil, I think what it does is it largely preempts a bidding war for the federal surplus that, if not totally vaporized, is going to be a whole lot smaller than anybody expected a year ago. What other factors are involved? Well, I think the cloud the size of a man's hand on the horizon is the impact of demographics, something that Prentice focuses on, and an aging population on rates of return in capital markets. I think everybody at this table has a vested interest in this, as I just came from a meeting in the university's pension plan yesterday in Edmonton. But the entire public sector, the Canada Pension Plan, the Caisse de dépôt, we are seeing a long-term prospect of declining returns in Canadian stock markets. That's going to have an impact on government revenues, but it's also going to have an impact on the cost of much of the retirement savings sector, raising questions as to how we are going to balance current consumption for saving for the future, especially for people who are approaching retirement. That is one of the big challenges facing all governments these days, and I don't know that we have any huge consensus on that issue. So I think that's enough for today. For right now, we'll deal with the questions after my colleagues here have had their say.
Thank you very much. Dr. Emery, we'll turn it on to you.
Wow, that's tough to follow. What I'd like to just start with is a couple of observations around what we might mean by turmoil. And turmoil seems to be in this context that the economy might not actually be growing, because we've had 15 years of unprecedented expansion. We have a peculiar situation that we're teaching students in undergraduate programs who have never actually lived through a recession. So they don't actually understand when we teach in our economics class what it means when unemployment rates go up. What might it mean when you don't expect just to move one job to another frictionlessly? So when we try and teach about the risks, say, of an economy to the next generation, or inform them why they should care about a government's approach to diversification versus specialization, why would it be so important to have a pipeline to Tidewater and things like that, there's generally a lack of awareness amongst more and more of the population about what the world looks like when it's not growing as an economy. And again, because the last 15 years has been driven largely by the development in China and India, and there's been just rapid demand for commodities, Alberta's never had to deal with what are we actually doing with the wealth and what are we going to do when this boom is over. For the last 10 years, we've been going around presenting that we did slowdown scenarios for Alberta which did not require a drop in oil prices. As soon as the oil price stopped growing, this economy we knew was going to adjust to what we would call a long-run equilibrium, which is a stagnant situation, because there is no evidence of technical progress or of ingenuity driving anything in this province that gives you the increase in the standard of living. So we have a bathtub model of migration that if there's a boom in Alberta and capital comes in, people come in, until we're always back at that same long-run wage for all those non-skilled workers or the ones that are most vulnerable. And then when the negative shocks hit, what do? We let them go somewhere else, like British Columbia and Saskatchewan, where we're seeing them go now. And so again, complacency comes in because we don't see employers demanding the temporary foreign workers anymore because their skill shortages are alleviating and they're not admitting that. And it's also because we adjust by getting rid of people and by getting rid of capital. So for Alberta, we don't really have a good public awareness about what adjustment means until it starts hitting the housing sector. And the biggest adjustment in Alberta with this downturn, which is just starting now, is the reversion in real estate prices, where most people hold their wealth and where most people hold their debt liabilities. In 1981, the real price of property in Calgary fell 50% in 1 year when the price of oil dropped and with the recession and the high interest rates. So the question we're increasingly posing to students, and I do this even with the MBA students I teach, is what's different now between 1980, 1929, or any other period of time when we've been kind of on the cusp of a major downturn. So if we go to 1929, what are the conditions that cause such problems for places like Alberta and Canada? Well, we saw a high reliance on natural resource exports. We saw a high reliance on a single market or a couple of markets for the destination for those outputs. And we were operating in a world where there was suddenly a glut of the commodity. So in other words, as we started running into trouble economically, we started to pump up exports to try and offset the various government deficits coming in, and that only had the effect of further depressing the price and pushing the spiral. Now, as Jeff alluded to, back then we had fixed exchange rates under the gold standard, which created a lot of the chaos because we were required to adjust our money supply based on demand for our exports and demand for investing in Canada. Now we have a flexible exchange rate, so everyone seems to think, okay, we're all right this time. But 2008, we used monetary policy to its full extent to avoid the real crisis that was coming on in the eyes of the central banks. And at this point in time, we effectively have 0% interest rates. What does that mean? We no longer have monetary policy as a tool to adjust to the next shock that hits this economy. So in other words, any adjustments going forward are going to be on the real side through employment, income, and wealth. Because we can't just keep adjusting exchange rates without some of these other effects coming through the money supply and some of the monetary factors. So there should be some nervousness, and the Bank of Canada keeps floating this idea we should be scared about all of the debt that's being held out there currently. Because as interest rates have gone to zero, lots of people have rationally said there is no reward for deferring my consumption. I'm going to live better now rather than in the future. And so as Jeff alluded to with pension schemes, the reason no one's saving is there's no return to saving. You might as well spend it now, have a bigger house, carry a bigger debt, because what's the problem? Well, the problems become we have a record stock of personal debt. We have that basically insured in a lot of ways through the public sector, through CMHC. They'll pick up all the housing debts if those turtle again. And we have lots of this debt being carried by two-earner households based on extremely low interest rates. So it will not take much of a bump in interest rates to start creating the cycle we saw in 1981, 1982. It will not create a large number of layoffs to do the same thing. And then once the snowball gets rolling, as governments in 2008 signaled, they don't know how to stop it. So their best bet is they have to act early and be proactive to try and stop things from getting worse. And the concern at this point is in 2008, 2009, it seems to have worked, even with policies that couldn't have worked, like the fiscal stimulus for the auto sector. But now in 2015, we don't have the same tools at our disposal. So the reason a lot of this turmoil is starting to become a problem is if you follow with the Bank of Canada's typical presentation, they explain how they used consumer spending to come out of the first threat. That has run its course as people are leveraged to the maximum. Then they sat around trying other things, lowering interest rates further to get it going, but what they've been waiting for has been a resumption of exports. Without the resumption of exports, if you were listening to the Bank of Canada a year or two ago, there is no future, because that's the only lever left to get this economy moving. They're pushing hard on productivity gains, but again, with a low dollar, the problem is all those crappy low productivity manufacturing jobs that we wanted to get rid of 20 years ago when we were talking about adopting the US dollar to get more productive. They then complained about that when Alberta oil made the exchange rate go to par with the US dollar, it was threatening those same jobs. And now that the exchange rate is low, what they're learning is they would rather keep people employed in lower productivity jobs than make the adjustment to the higher productivity economy. They used the same buffer in 1982 with the National Energy Program to defer the adjustment in Ontario to protect incomes and to protect wealth in that province. So moving from Canada to Alberta, what should you be worried about in Alberta? Well, you're the shock absorber for central Canada. And I'm saying you are because apparently when I say these things, I'm told by people in Alberta I should just move somewhere else. So I'll say, the true Albertans who are going to remain, you have to be worried that when you have a stock of wealth, like oil, which increasingly they're not interested in Keystone in the east or Gateway to the Tidewater, what are they talking about? Using the oil for an in-Canada strategy. Refining in New Brunswick, keeping the energy price low for consumers in central Canada, basically keeping people in central Canada comfortable at the expense of wealth in the West. And so when we look at this, the signs on the horizon, if the Eurozone runs into trouble, if all of those sovereign debts that were created out of the toxic assets of 2008, 2009 start to default, and we start to see the drop in exports, or if China slows down, then what does Canada have? What is the contingency plan for the Harper government with slower growth? What does Jim Prentice have in mind when the oil sands don't come back as quickly? We're hearing discussions about diversification strategies, but we heard those with Redford. We heard those previously with everyone but Ralph Klein. Ralph Klein was explicitly about specialization to generate the income to retire the debt. Prior to him, we had Peter Lougheed, who was aggressively trying to diversify the economy. Don Getty got desperate and went into some bad investments and has basically discredited any attempts to diversify the economy away from oil and gas since. But we're going to have to think outside the box going forward because the global economy is not going to be the wealth creator for Alberta that it was. And we're even more at risk because we can be seen as a place where labor can be poached for Ontario or they can do bad things with policy to transfer wealth. We don't have the political clout to stave that off. We've learned that repeatedly. But what we have to start worrying about is how do we promote better policy in Edmonton and Ottawa that's more proactive, thinking in a more futuristic way. Instead of thinking about the deficit today, what is the human capital plan going forward for the 25% unemployment of 15 to 25-year-olds in central Canada? What is the plan for the East Coast economies if suddenly they don't have oil and gas, and even worse, they don't have Fort McMurray? Because it turns out Cape Breton had a lot of boom going on just because they had fly-in, fly-out labor. So again, the interconnectedness of all of this means that the economy is going to slow, and by the time our statistics catch up to it over the next year, it might be too late with the federal election underway and with the Alberta election over. But part of it is just people starting to ask questions about what have we got in place to stave off the next shock.
Thank you very much. That gives us food for thought, and we'll continue. Dr. Harrison, please.
Yeah, thank you. I mentioned to Herb earlier today, actually, I understood he had been speaking on Dave Taylor's show on radio a couple of weeks back, and one of the callers afterwards phoned in apparently to Dave Taylor and said, why do you keep having these left-wing academics from the UofC on there? So I actually feel really at home having Herb, who is appropriately sitting now to my left. So probably no surprise in some ways. I actually find myself agreeing with a lot of what has actually been said by both Geoffrey and Herb. A couple things I want to add, and I'm going to probably take some things to a more kind of global level here. I kept scribbling out and knocking off things here because we could, I'm sure, talk for the next 5 hours here. I'm going to dismiss out of hand any discussion about wars and conflicts going on, because I think these are actually, in some sense, they always seem to be with us, and many of the cases, such as ISIS, I think is actually a really temporary kind of aberration. The bigger thing in terms of oil and petroleum, and again, this is a really problematic one because we have all kinds of predictions out there where it's going to go, and anyone who predicts where oil is going to go, I think, is just fooling themselves, if not the rest of us. Jim Stanford has said that he thinks it could go to $10 or $20 a barrel. I mean, in fact, it seems now to be stabilizing around 50. And of course, fairly infamously, a few years back, Jeff Rubin said it was going to go to $210 a barrel, and he's still trying to live that down. I suspect there's a lot of books in the pickle barrel someplace being discounted on that one. The fact is, though, for Canada, and we've been depicted in two different ways. The Prime Minister wanted a few years ago and continued to suggest we're a petroleum superpower. And on the other hand, people have suggested that we're becoming actually really kind of a petro state. And to what extent that applies more to Alberta and not so much to Canada, I think the reality is it falls someplace in between there. We're certainly not a petro superpower. We're basically a price taker. We're not a price setter. And the recent crisis is showing that once again. If there is actually a good thing coming out of what's actually been going on right now in terms of pricing, it's been mentioned the fact that to some extent this is actually a boon to Ontario. There's always been this kind of trade-off. You know, one place booms and the other one busts. Well, that's the nature of Canada's confederation and the way things were distributed. To some extent, then, we're not collapsing as far as we might if we were truly a petro state like Saudi Arabia, where the only thing that's produced is oil, then you would see everything really collapsing. But the other parts of the economy are kind of picking things up. That's helpful. Even the dollar actually declining is to some extent offsets the problem for Alberta, because of course we get paid in American dollars. So it's not, the denomination actually helps us more than Jim Prentice wants to argue at the present time. So out of all this suggests that perhaps the Canadian economy is a little bit more resilient, a little bit more diversified than we realize. Now that doesn't help Alberta because, again, as Herb has said, the long-standing mission for every premier has been we want to diversify, and we haven't seemed to be able to do that. On the other end, diversification comes in all kinds of forms. So it doesn't mean that you have to just get away from petroleum. Petroleum is what we do, but how do you actually use it? How do you build in that value added? And over time, we've actually started to do a little bit of that in the province for sure. I'm going to mention just a couple of other things here that I think are really important. One is Geoffrey also mentioned about transfer payments. There is actually still a bit of a problem for Canada, and Corshane mentioned this some 20 years ago in terms of once we adopted free trade. Harold Innes years ago talked about the problems of actually keeping Canada together, coherent, cohesive, because in fact, and that's what the national policy is supposed to do, right? Change things in an east-west direction. Well, what we've done is gone into a north-south. And as Corshane mentioned, this creates real problems, because if you don't have money coming in, but there's going to be provinces, regions going to go down, the old system of transfers was east-west, but how do you justify that when we have a north-south economy? I think that still is a potential problem down the road for us, particularly as the federal government seems to be threatening to want to get out of an awful lot of cost-sharing agreements. The environment, global warming, resource depletion, these are all very real things for the planet, let alone for Canada. I think this is going to have economic effects. The last thing I'm going to just mention and take some time on, and it's something that Herb talked about earlier today and has mentioned again right now, is the nature of the recent economic crisis, and we're still suffering from it. It is quite true. It was really a private sector crisis. The derivatives and everything else, the frankly criminality in many instances, as we've come to find out. David McNally a few years back in a book, Global Slump, said that governments around the world at that time, particularly in North America and Europe, actually bailed out the private sector to the account of $20 trillion. And that has, it basically, again, what was private debt suddenly became public debt. And this is very much what's actually going on in Europe right now with the policies of austerity for the last few years. Our system, the way we've created it throughout the 20th century, has depended upon a kind of virtuous cycle of production and consumption. But over the last 25 years or so in many Western countries, real wages have actually been deteriorating. And so as real wages have deteriorated and have not kept up with inflation, the way that we've actually gone about trying to keep people buying things to increase demand has actually been to resort to easier and easier credit. And this was the basis of, particularly in the United States, the crisis that came about. In 2007, when I started to really think about what was actually happening, I thought, well, why were they letting people buy these houses in the first place? They had no jobs. Well, it's because the financial system needed people to keep buying. Now, the problem is right now, it's for the last 10 years, and I know I've held off on all kinds of investments, waiting for those inflation, for the rates to actually start going up again, all right? Piketty has actually said the normal rate actually is in normal times is we increase by about 1.5%, 2%. Anything above that is really rare. But we've been so addicted to thinking we can get those 5-6% returns or more, so we keep waiting. And for the last 10 years, does a month go by that somebody doesn't raise the fact that possibly they're going to be raising interest rates? The Bank of Canada will be doing this, but it hasn't happened. In fact, what's actually been happening is they keep lowering it. And the reason for this is because they're still trying to incentivize people to take on more and more debt. In terms of the arrows in their quiver, central banks now really don't have very many arrows left. And the only one they have is to keep lowering interest rates. And that would seem to be actually a fairly failed policy in trying to continue to stimulate demand. On the other hand, the absolute worst thing to be doing is what they've done in Europe, where the austerity practices are actually gutting many of the economies. Which brings me to the other thing I want to talk about here. So we have really increasing levels of inequality. And it's not, again, in Europe, it's not just in Canada, in Alberta. One of the wealthiest periods in the history of any territory on the planet, Alberta over the last 30 years, from 1982 to 2012, the bottom 90% of Albertans never actually saw a real increase. It's a flat line, right? And so, but the gap between the rich and poor is getting larger and larger. But a lot of people are being really left out. There's a lot of jobs being created, but they're really bad jobs. They're temporary, they're part-time, they're really insecure, they're what Guy Standing has referred to as the precarious workers, which are increasing all around the world. This also has real effects on demand, and it has real psychological effects on whether or not people even want to take on debt. In the first place, doesn't matter what interest rates you offer things at. And this is particularly, I think, a real growing crisis of youth unemployment. We see that in Europe, where the unemployment rate for those 25 and under for the last almost a decade now is going on at between 50 and 58%. It's becoming very much a kind of lost generation in many of these places. It's not as bad yet here, but it is we aren't isolated from what goes on in the rest of the world. And it is something we should be really concerned about, because not just economically, but politically, it is dynamite to have a lot of people left out of the perception that they have opportunities that we've all kind of got used to over the years. So I'm going to leave it at that. There's many, many other things I could talk about here, but that's definitely enough to chew on for now.
Thank you, Trevor. Wonderful. I think we've all been challenged. And as I look out at you as you listen, I can almost see the wheels turning, and I'm sure that there are now many comments or questions. So please, the floor is now open, and you can ask Geoffrey, Emery, or Trevor individually, or give them the option of who answers your questions.